now listening to the Come to the Table podcast with your host, Sean McCoy, where each week he invites a guest and welcomes them to the table to discuss any and all topics. First and foremost, Christians are called to love all people, and one of the best ways to love them is to sit down, talk with them, and listen to what they have to say. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining yet another episode of the Come to the Table podcast. I'm your host, Sean McCoy, and I have to tell you, on a personal level, this is one of those things that getting the chance to do this particular show and have this particular guest on is really kind of in the back of my head, something I'm very, very happy about because it's a little bit of a dream come true. I got into podcasts 3 or 4 years ago when I used to travel quite a bit, and one of the podcasts I came across at the time was called The Brian Callen Show, and it became the Mixed Mental Arts podcast that's currently right around 300 episodes. And there's a gentleman on that show who started as a guest and became actually part of the show and a co-host and a real driving force behind it. And his name is Maats. And listening to somebody speak for that many episodes in something like this, you begin to feel like you know them. You begin to feel like you hear them. You even hear some of their tics. You hear some of the things that they do, and you really get a chance to hear who they are. And there's only so many times you can do that without really coming across as to who you are. And I got such a sense of humility from him, because at the same time, what you'll find out is from as we measure it, Hunter is an extremely intelligent gentleman, and he's highly educated, and more than that, he's very aware, and he's been part of this journey, and he's been part of this podcast on his end in an effort in his life to take these ideas out of books, these wonderful ideas that are out there, and try to take them, instead of them being something neat to talk about on the shelf, and really put them into society and into cultures and into people and into everyday life, and make them pragmatic and help solve real problems. So at the end of it, no matter what else, I hope what comes across most about Hunter is that he's a compassionate, loving human being who wants the world to be a better place and is doing everything he can to make that happen. So at the same time, I've asked him to come on, and I'll ask him to come on more than once, because I would love to have him come on as many times as he'd like. But I think it's the good subject, or a great topic to talk about, is around science. And one of those things that divides us, and definitely divides us around religious and specifically Christian to non-believers, or Christian to science, is around things like the theory of evolution and different topics like that it becomes such a black and white issue and such a polarizing issue that's either all one, all the other, either you're on this side or that side, and it's just, there just seems to be some division there. And as you guys and gals know, what we're trying to do here ultimately is have a conversation. If you're tuning in and hoping that Hunter and I get into a debate and that I find some sort of neat thing I can say to him to zing across the table per se, then you have the wrong podcast. It's really meant to have a conversation and let two people talk about things, and how this relationship and how what allows me to feel comfortable with this is that there are things that he has done and said along those lines, which really, and I know this from other emails and stuff that we've talked about, that he's all for it, and he loves this kind of thing. And amongst as intelligent as he is, and I think he's like 6 or 7 languages and all kinds of stuff like that, that at the same time, he has a healthy respect and a healthy dose of humility, and he knows that it doesn't make him better than anybody else. And there's so many of these things, and he actually used in some of his blogs, one of the ones that really got to me, and I contacted him about it, was he started quoting scripture around Matthew and around the plank in other people's eye, and using that same argument within the scientific community. He's basically saying, back to kind of his own kind of brethren and people that he identified with, hey, you're using this as a religion. And it's even as somebody who doesn't, we kind of get a little bit ahead, but who, as far as I know, we'll talk about that in a bit, isn't a Sunday Christian kind of guy, or even somebody who believes in Christianity, but that he was using the principles around Scripture, and even talked about Jesus being an outstanding neuroscientist, which we can ask him about as well, and I'll let him explain. But anyway, like I said, this is a discussion. This is a come to the table. We're here to hear not only from myself, but from my guests. So without further ado, I'm going to go grab Hunter, and I will be right back. All right, and with that, it is my pleasure to introduce you guys to Mr. Hunter Maats. Hunter, how are you, buddy?
Well, firstly, no mister, please. I think that goes without saying, Sean. And, it's a real pleasure to be on the show. And I think that, I love the first episode of Come to the Table. And that is really I think the humanity at its best, and I think that whatever group we may affiliate ourselves with, that we need more of that happening everywhere.
I know you do believe that, and I do appreciate that. It means a lot coming from you because you have quite a bit of experience with podcasts and interviews and things of that nature. So it's good. I will file that away for one of those little feel good things. And before we get started into the actual subject, and instead of just jumping into it, one of the things that I like to do to kind of get the mental juices or just going, as well as kind of do a little insight into who you are without having to do a whole show around your biography, but to give the listeners a little bit of insight. One of the other podcasts I listen to is called Team Never Quit. It's with two SEALs, Marcus Luttrell and David Rutherford, and the whole idea is they help inspire people around never quit stories. But for them to get their guests kind of going, they do what they call a Mad Minute. And so I do a version of that, and it's called the Deep Dive, and it's just a handful of questions that don't have any right or wrong. And so I'd like to ask them to you at this point, if you're ready.
I'm ready.
Number one, what irrational fear do you have?
Ooh, if we're talking, well, I think the best way to talk about this is as a kid, I had all sorts of anxiety and control issues over school. Like I desperately wanted to be smart and wanted to do well in school. And it's amazing. Like now it would, if I'd lived in America and if I'd had access to these things, I guarantee you I would have been diagnosed with OCD. But I had all sorts of rituals and like rules and sub rules around touching wood. And I would literally like have a pencil on me so that I could touch the wood on the pencil. And then, but like I was like, oh, I don't want to like knock on wood with my head because that's saying my head is wood. And that would be, it was dumb. So, there was like a whole complex set of rituals that I developed there. And that was, I think like if you want to get really, Pixar talks about core memories, and what are these sort of like core emotional childhood things that have driven so much of us. Like I think that, so much of why I care about giving people and empowering people with the confidence to know that they have the potential to learn anything they want is because I didn't have that confidence. And yeah, I think that's a big irrational fear, and it's taken me a long time to start to work through that.
So one of the things I'll do as a side note to that, because I know that you don't operate this way, but I will plug your book. So you're not, amongst all the things that you actually are an accomplished author with Katie O'Brien as well, and you wrote a book called The Straight A Conspiracy, which is, I think, is in the realm of what you're just talking about, right? In terms of intelligence and how you go about that, what it means to be smart. And can you talk about that for just a moment in terms of that book?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, a large part of where we'll talk about, sort of the log in our own eye is, I think that, science bears a tremendous amount of responsibility for undermining our faith in human potential, and that, now what we're trying to do is undo that damage and make that right. And a big part of it was that, when I moved out to LA, I was working with all these kids, and I would hear them say things like, I didn't get the math gene, or I don't have a natural ear for languages. And, I recognized all that thinking because that was a lot of the thinking that I'd had in high school where I didn't feel smart. And so then, what Katie and I did was we started trying to understand that, pick that apart, and then the Straight A Conspiracy emerged out of us wandering across 7 fields of psychology and neuroscience to empower kids with an actual usable, practical playbook that they could, have to build the confidence in their own intelligence and then have the tools to actually take charge of their own educations. But we were very clear the whole time that we were doing it that we were writing the book that we wished we'd had in high school. I think that's a pretty core part of what I've done. And then mixed mental arts has really evolved out of that. It's really about building that intellectual confidence that I never had.
So, like I said, folks, giving back and really somebody who has a compassion and a heart for other people, and that's a good evidence. And so if that intrigues you at all, again, he didn't ask me to plug this. I will do it for him. He wrote a book. You can find it out there, The Straight A Conspiracy. So we'll just throw that out there real quick. So question number 2, what are you really good at, but kind of embarrassed that you are good at it?
Let's see. I would say that if I'm going to toot my own horn at something, I think that's always the interesting thing is that the things that that you're good at, what it actually requires to be good at them. So something that I get a lot of praise for is speaking lots of languages. but it's sort of like the magician knowing their own tricks. Like,
Right.
you know what's required to do this thing, and so therefore you know that it's not that magical. And it's always a slightly uncomfortable thing because people are, again, like in terms of simple narratives, people say things like, oh my God, you speak 10, 20 languages. And, you yourself know, like, where is your state of knowledge in all of these languages? Where is it currently? And then how much you don't know. I mean, even the idea, I had this conversation with Isaiah Gooley, who's part of the mixed martial arts community, about languages. And like, even in English, right? We would say, oh, we're fluent English speakers because we can have this conversation. But take either of us and put us in a hospital in a room full of doctors, and there's just going to be all sorts of words floating around, and we're going to be like, what are you guys talking about? I thought I spoke English.
Right. No,
so yeah.
Yeah, no, and it's very much that. But I think there's, that realization of your own limitations, and then what does it really mean to be good at it? And then if you start looking at the English language for what it is, do you really know it that well, to your point, and what makes you fluent? And I remember that episode you had with Isaiah about, and he knows Chinese very well, but even then it's still this, it's just this ongoing, this thing, yeah. So how many languages, as a side note, not to contradict what you're saying, but I'm just curious, how many languages would you say you are, quote unquote, fluent, or that you're fluent in, that you can have a conversation?
Yeah, I think the more useful thing is thinking in terms of sort of language families. So, because that's in terms of the magician revealing their tricks. That's one of the big things is that. So let's say that I give you a word and you have to learn this word in a foreign language and you have to learn it on its own. It's actually really hard to learn that because you don't have anything to work against, anything to contrast it with, right? So I tell you to eat is manger in French, right? And that's like, okay, that's an isolated piece of information. But when I then tell you that to eat in Italian is mangiare, right? And you might have heard like mangiamo or something like that. Let's eat. Now it actually becomes easier to learn those two pieces of information because you're like, oh, how are these things the same? Oh, they both begin with M-A-N-G. And then, I can think about a manger, which is where an animal would eat from. And so the more information you have, actually, the easier it becomes to learn. But of course, that's because there is enough similarity there that the contrast is quite useful. So like the Romance languages, I'm pretty solid in general. French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese is rusty, but I could brush it up. If I actually ever wanted to get into Romanian, it wouldn't be too hard for me to get into. Germanic languages are pretty good. My dad is Dutch, so, I have a passable knowledge of Dutch, and German, if I ever put some real effort into it, could get up to speed pretty quickly, speak some Swedish. So and then some of the Slavic languages, and then a really embarrassing level of Chinese, and then my Japanese was very good in high school. If I ever put some work into it and brushed it up, I could get it back up to speed. But it's so there's, if we're going to give a number, the number I sometimes give is like in the 7 to 10 range. But, they're all in various states of disrepair.
Gotcha. So when you dream, what do you dream? What language do you dream in? Or do you hear? Or when you think, do you think in English, or do you? Or does
it is one of those things where it really is about like firing up the gears and getting the mental juices flowing. Like I'm going to be in Italy in a week or so, and I'll be speaking Italian. I'll be surrounded by Italian. I'll be reading Italian. And all of that muscle will start to get going, and then you start to get really comfortable and you start to enter into that cultural space. Or if I'm around Spanish speakers a lot, like I will get into and start to enter into that. So it really is like, I think that's the amazing transformative power of culture is that it's like a fish being in water. And, for the last year I've been swimming in an English language environment. But if I start swimming in those waters enough, like it's amazing how much you start to code switch. And this is something that I think a great person to talk about this with is a Texan like you, where there's the code switching that happens, like, when you're at Schlumberger and you're around academics and people who talk a certain way, it's one thing, but then we get you back to Texas and, the Texan accent starts coming out, the slang, the thinking starts changing. And that is the power of us, is just how flexible we are to different environments. Yeah. And language is one of the ways that switches most quickly.
Yeah, no, I think I phrase it like, I tell you what, no, I'm fixing to go do something. And I can remember traveling. I've been very fortunate to travel like you have. And so definitely that appreciation for those cultures. And I can remember being in Scotland, and of course, name like Sean Michael McCoy, there's always that, that voice has been in my head since I was a kid. Oh, you're Scottish or you're Irish, and you go over there and you start to feel like you're part of it, and you start talking, you start getting then you feel like you're part of that, and all that good stuff. You start to feel like you can almost talk that way. So I definitely understand, and that's really an interesting concept. If for nothing else, I think in looking at the languages, and that almost goes along with what you were saying about learning, that I know for a lot of us, the idea that you learn something is, okay, well, I got to memorize all the words so that I can replace it for this word, versus, as you just alluded to, you're kind of almost bathing in it and just immersing yourself in everything about it, in the atmosphere and all of those things. That it's not just communicating it or reading it, or it's actually living it and feeling it. That's really, yeah, I love it. Love the answer. So I got a couple more. Third one is, if you could make a 20-second phone call to yourself at any point in your life, past or present, past or in the future, when would you call yourself and what would you say?
I think that one's easy. I would call myself as a teenager, and I would say making mistakes is good. And I would just quickly lay out that the feeling, there's a reason why I say I feel stupid, and it's because stupid is the feeling of shame. That, what shame does is it causes us to avoid things, and primarily you're avoiding mistakes. And if I could tell myself that instead of being ashamed of mistakes, you should be curious about them and analyze them and pick them apart the way the FAA does until you figured out why it happened and what you need to do to prevent it, I think that would have saved me a lot of misery. So, yeah.
Yeah, it makes me think of, like the FFA or the FAA. I know that Schlumberger, we did it. NASA, big time failure analysis type stuff that really goes in. And instead of looking at it and just saying, "Well, this mistake happened," and everybody's stupid, but just that, to your point, truly learning from it. And so, amen. Definitely love that answer. So the last two are kind of the standard two, but I'll ask the number 4 question, which is, what is your belief, faith, or spiritual mantra? What is Hunter's? How do you identify, or do you? I
mean, I believe in reality, and I believe that none of us knows what it is.
Gotcha. So we had Kate. We had Kate on here, and she's doing our second episode, and she said that you were because she mentioned you quite a bit. We talked about you quite a bit. So this isn't the first time that people will probably be hearing your name, or the last. She said that it's like an apologetic apotheosis, or she said it was.
Yeah. I mean, the honest truth, right, is that I've tangled a lot with the new atheists. And, it's amazing how black and white their thinking is. And they're just like, do you believe in God? Do you believe in God? Right. And, and so the thing that I've taken to saying is that I'm an apatheist, which is that I choose not to even, to me, humanity has spent so much time arguing about that question. And I would just to really focus on helping each other and fixing our problems as much as we can. I think that, to the conversation that we're really going to get into, I think that there is a consilience coming. And I think that I believe in emergence. And I think that, the universe is large and complex, and that, whatever answers they are will increasingly unfold before us. I don't know that we'll ever reach the answer, and I think that's not really the point. I think the point is the exploration and the spirit of discovery, and let's see what unfolds. But I don't know, is the honest truth. I think that the idea that as part of that reality, the idea that any human being has the intelligence or the understanding to be able to offer some sort of definitive answer one way or the other, I find I have a real problem with that. And I think there, in general, it's an act of faith.
Yeah, and here's the thing. So these questions, and I don't know, and if I didn't do you justice, then I apologize. But obviously, there's no right or wrong answer to this. This is not an attempt to set up or anything like that, as we talked about. It really, to me, it's fair to set this stage and allow those kind of comments to happen. And that is what you believe in. And hear me, that has to be okay on some level for me. And I know that may ruffle some of the feathers of those that I share the Christian faith with that I need to either somehow, I don't know, challenge that or whatever. I think you're going to believe what you're going to believe in, and I think that's okay. And it's not my direct job to challenge that or come at you or anything like that. And that is where you are, and I think there's nothing wrong. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And you said faith, and the reason I think about that is I remember my pastor who was an extremely strong influence on me when I became a Christian, is he told me, said, faith implies doubt, and it is that part of it. It's what I struggled with. It is that unknown, because there is that massive unknown, to your point. As I explained, I think as I mentioned to you before, and as a lot of listeners know, I didn't grow up at all in the church. I was a science, logic, learning, that kind of guy. To your point, didn't feel like there was a lot of those answers, and I had, my own journey along those lines and where I came into it. But to be fair, there's that ultimate thing of I don't know. And if I'm blowing a hole in this podcast and everybody out there who says I'm a Christian, at the end of the day, I believe that. But I mean, can I ultimately 100,000% prove it or tell you that unequivocally? There is that doubt there, and it is part of the equation. So I don't think there's, and I'm not going to apologize. Like I said before, I'm not going to apologize for what I believe in, and I don't think you should necessarily have to apologize for what you believe in, unless, of course, you believe I should burn at the stake or something. If it's kind of one of those extremists, as we talk, as popular in the MMA side, and as you mentioned a lot, as those extreme fundamentalists who believe that is literally the only way, and the rest of the world should be decimated from it. I'm definitely not a fan of that thinking. So the last question is, I wanted to get what is your general impression of Christians? If somebody says they're a Christian, kind of what is your, and again, honesty and fairness, right? As much as you wish, to whatever degree, and then I have one more follow up to that one.
I think my own evolution with this is when I was 13 or as a teenager, Father Knott, who was a very sweet old Jesuit priest, got together all the first years and asked who would like to volunteer to help him serve Mass. And literally nobody put their hand up. And I felt bad for this old man because, he was going to find out that nobody wanted to do this. So I volunteered. And I didn't realize this at the time that I was signing myself up for a 5-year commitment because nobody else would ever want the job. And so I served Catholic Mass for 5 years. And I think that, I never was very emotionally engaged with what was going on. Like, I certainly, understood the principles and had some sort of vague appreciation for Jesus' teachings. And then, would hear the sort of caricature. I mean, I think this is the other part. My father's Dutch, my mother's American. And I just remember being in college and being around liberals who would tell me about how simultaneously in the same breath, how we shouldn't stereotype, but let me tell you about all those crazy Bible thumpers in the flyover states. And my mother's from Kansas, and, my own relatives aren't particularly religious, but the very fact that you're talking about not stereotyping and then talking about the flyover states, like places that you're literally saying you've never been to and you don't really know any of these people. And so I think that, I moved around enough between cultures that I've always been a little bit skeptical of any sort of caricature of a group of people. But, I think part of what we'll get into this story is that even with all of that, I never really met any creationists. And then I had this experience of tutoring a student who was at Oaks Christian, and that it was a school that was deliberately set up to teach the controversy around evolution. And then it was a real eye-opener because certainly it really was. I mean, we talked about this a little bit before the podcast, but, the whole conflict over religion is really just one of these Hatfield and McCoy things. And I think that, it'll be good for a McCoy, and then, I guess that makes me the Hatfield or the Maats field, to really get into this divide, because the cognitive dissonance for me and the conflict was that I found that a lot of people in the community of Christian were very decent, compassionate, caring people, which I don't think was my impression. And then the other thing, too, was that, they made me very aware of the faults of my own tribe and the things that we had done wrong, and it was, in general, very uncomfortable.
Gotcha. So the last one, if we can go at so Christians are one thing, but what about the religion of Christianity as you know it? I mean, I guess it's kind of the same question, so we can just skip that. But let's just go into the next one, which is really the topic. So what I'd asked Hunter to do, which I felt that he was very good at, which he could do very well, and it would be a great topic to start out with, was around science. As he had mentioned, and as I talked about before, there seems to be this Hatfield and McCoy kind of feud. And I told him earlier when he had mentioned that obviously that's one that I can identify with my last name being McCoy. And I actually did some research, and the story that I told him and what I saw and have seen from that is Devil Anse Hatfield was the patriarch on the Hatfield side. And at the end of that entire feud, after people had died during this revenge thing, that he basically had this moment of clarity right before he passed away, and he basically said something to the effect of all of this hate and vitriol and arguing back and forth and trying to get the, I think Dr. Martin Luther King was one of the ones I like to quote all the time, is the problem with an eye for an eye justice is everybody ends up blind, is that you end up with this destruction, and that there really is definitely no progress, definitely no winner, definitely nothing positive to come from that. And so I felt that way along these lines between the Christian faith and the way the Christians look at things and the way that, at least it's portrayed and the way a lot of people talk about, and we look at something like science and we look at something like the theory of evolution, that it literally has to be one or the other. And so to that, the idea behind the podcast today is to ask Hunter to sit around and we can have a conversation about science with things like the theory of evolution, and then kind of whatever other topics come up. So if I was going to ask you about, Mr. Maats, and I know you told me not to call you that, but Hunter, if I asked you, and that's that cultural Southern thing, right? It's the yes sir, no sir, and all that good stuff. And if I asked you to help me understand the theory of revolution, the theory of evolution, and if I was coming from just a standpoint of kind of, I'm a creationist, or let's say, and from an argument standpoint, even though I'm personally not, which is to the story I think as well, that okay, what would you? I don't know. Where would you start to explain to me what the theory of evolution is?
Well, I mean, I was going to say, this is exactly the problem that I had when I was tutoring my student at Oaks Christian, because, the reality is that, the way that science is usually taught, right, is that, let's imagine that I'm talking about the theory of evolution and I'm teaching it at, a science or technology high school here in Los Angeles. Well, the point is that a lot of what I'm relying on in communicating that is a basic assumption that science is good, scientists are experts, and if scientists tell us these things, that they must be true, right? And that's sort of the sort of rule of thumb, or the quick way that people are deciding what to believe or what not to believe. When you're suddenly doing that in the environment of a place like Oaks Christian, suddenly there's a whole different set of assumptions. And it's, why should we trust science? Why should we trust scientists? And then you can't rely on the authority of science. And one of the interesting things about Oaks was that I didn't think much of their science department, but their rhetoric and English department is probably the best that I've ever seen anywhere. And one of the things that they were particularly good at was dealing with logical fallacies, because obviously if you are a creationist, and some of the students and faculty there are, then that you're going to have people who are going to attack your beliefs forever and are going to try and argue around them. And so you better understand argumentation. And, I had never really been exposed to, the logical fallacies until I was at Oaks, right? And I'm there as a teacher, and I'm only now encountering these things. And one of them is appeal to authority. And that's a basic logical fallacy. And if you're a scientist, you should be relying on evidence to communicate these things and not appealing to authority. And that is most of how science is communicated to people who already agree with scientists. So I think that's the first thing is that, if I can't rely on appealing to authority, to you, Sean, then now I have to work much harder because now I have to really do it based on the evidence, and I have to also really think about the evidence that you have available to you. And also, more fundamentally, we first have to clear up what is science. And I think that would be a really, really good place for us to start is, what is science? And, it's like any of these things. It's like any of these, capitalism or what is a Democrat or what is a Christian. Any of these words come loaded and freighted with assumptions. And I think, we should first clear up what science is.
Perfect. Let's roll. I think it's a great idea. So to
awesome.
That, yeah. What is science?
So,
yeah.
Yeah, and I think Atul Gawande, who I'm a big fan of his. He's written some amazing books like the Checklist Manifesto, and he's a surgeon, and he gave this speech at Caltech, and part of what that speech is about his own journey into understanding science and what science really is. And he says, when I was a young man, I went away to college. I was suddenly exposed to all this science, and I thought I was so smart. And so I went back home, and I proceeded to tell everybody what idiots they were, correct the errors in their thinking, and share with them the benefit of my new knowledge. And he's like, and I'm sure that they all really appreciated it. And he said, but ultimately I came to understand that that wasn't really what science is about, and that the scientific mind is an experimental mind, not a litigious one. That's really what science is about. So, I read that and I absolutely relate to it. And, I certainly, as a young man, was litigious, thought I knew it all. And then, as I've come to understand science, I've come to understand that it really is about humility. It is about the experimental mindset, and it is about testing your own beliefs against reality. And that's really all that science is. It's basically just saying, hey, humans come up with stories. We have beliefs about reality. We have beliefs about how things work. We should always be testing out what we believe against what we can observe and see how well the stories that we come up with about reality actually fit reality. But the problem is that, science has obviously had a tremendous amount of success in some areas like infectious diseases, and, figuring out the mechanics of the universe over the last few hundred years. And so what happens is that there's science as that sort of experimental mindset and as that way of knowing and that methodology. And then there's the accumulated dogma of science. And there's the arrogance of science, and there's the tribe of science, which basically is like, we're the good guys. We have figured everything out. Before us, there was famine and pestilence and plague, and then we solved all the problems of the world. And that's where we move from science as the method to science as the tribe, and that's when we start to spin and confabulate these narratives about, we're the good guys, you're the bad guys. So I think it's, for me, science is about that method and that way of testing your own beliefs and sort of struggling with your own beliefs. And the problem that I have and what I've had to overcome is, science as, we're the Hatfields, we're the best, and you're the McCoys, and you're terrible.
And so it reminds me of, and I think it was one of the recent episodes with Jared Diamond, who wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel. And he was talking about his experience in New Guinea. And if I remember correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it was the one about that the farmers they were doing the way they laid out their farms, instead of being horizontal, they were vertical relative to the mountain range. And then the scientists came in and were like, oh, no, you got to drain it. And let me tell you, this is the scientific way to do something. And then they came in and redid it. The monsoons came and it just basically leveled all the topsoil. Am I remembering that correctly? Is that?
You are remembering that absolutely correctly. And the big problem is that, this discipline that is supposed to be about humility, because has become a victim of its own success. And that a lot of experts are extremely arrogant, and then they confuse their prejudices for what actually makes sense. And so, yeah, absolutely. The experts came in, they told the people who had been living there for tens of thousands of years that they didn't know how to live there, and a disaster ensued. So, I think that not not just you as a Christian, but, that is probably the sort of Christians that listen to your podcast can appreciate that a gospel that is about humility can be corrupted and co-opted by people who use it to justify their arrogance.
And I think you're being kind as well, and I appreciate that, because my next comment was going to be around the idea of no matter where the arrogance comes from, right? That arrogance is typically not well received, regardless of which way it's coming. And if anything, if that resonates with somebody who's listening, I like to think that. So imagine where that arrogance is coming from, and when you feel like you have the ultimate answer, which is really kind of what, whether it's from a scientific standpoint or someplace else, if it's just merely coming and just telling somebody that you have it for the sake of it, and basically just kind of shoving it down somebody's throat and waiting for them to acquiesce, I don't know very many instances of that where it worked and actually worked out, especially for the long term. You may get somebody to relent for the moment, but it's not something that's going to be really. It's not going to stick around for a while, and it definitely isn't going to be relational, and definitely isn't going to be any kind of prosperity or positive relationship between the two. And so I definitely appreciate your aspect on that. And so around science, it also made me think of, because we tend to, a little bit like what you talked about in the beginning, we tend to think of science sometimes as something that only smart people do, or somebody in a lab coat, or somebody who has a PhD, or somebody who's got a master's and all the rest of that stuff. And a lot like you, I've become a little bit disenfranchised with some of that higher education, although I like it. And it reminds me of one of your guests that you had on, which was one of my favorites, which was Spiros. And I remember one of the first episodes he was on, if not the first, when you guys were mentioning his qualifications and how he was a quantum physicist. And his comment was, well, according to Georgia Tech, if I recall correctly, and he basically was saying in one simple phrase that, according to this curriculum based on the Georgia Tech University, said all I have to do is X, Y, Z, and now I am magically a quantum physicist, where it's really much more than that. All that to say that people, even though you may not be that, have the capacity to do what you said around science, which is that idea of reason, which is that idea of kind of trial and error, which is really along the lines of the scientific method, right? Which is, if this works, go with it. Which is kind of where the house, what's the, I'm forgetting it now, but it's not like the house, the mother's rule or the housewives rule, that, the urban, not an urban legend so much, but something that, that do this, rub a little this on it, or my mom was, somebody's mom from way back who may not have ever been somebody highly educated, but they knew that if you did this or this, it kind of made, it solved a problem. Maybe it was cure a cold, or maybe it was something like that. And that within the context of what you're saying, that science is really just that pursuit of what works. And if it doesn't work, try something else until it does. And if it does, maybe share it, but then don't guard it and don't use it as something to hold over people. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's entirely fair, and I would yes and what you're saying and build off of it, and saying that not only is something that science that people can do, it's something that people were doing long before science. And this is something that we've always done. And the whole point of science was to make us better at testing our belief against the observable evidence. And, I had a conversation with Mohammed Jalan, he's a Muslim. He's very much practicing Muslim. He's a Muslim scholar, but he's also a neuroscience PhD and is getting his medical degree right now. Or maybe he has his medical degree and he's getting his neuroscience PhD. But he and I had a conversation about what is science. And I think that there's, the narrative of science that has been told in the West is, what I like to call the underpants gnome view of intellectual history. So I don't know if your listeners, how many of them watch South Park, but there's a great episode where the boys realize that their underpants are going missing. Like someone is stealing them, and they decide that it's the underpants gnomes. And that what they need to do is stay up all night until the underpants gnomes show up, and, they can catch them red-handed in the act of stealing their underpants and try and figure out why they're stealing the underpants. And so they do, and then they ask the underpants gnome, why are you stealing our underwear? And they said, very simple. Step 1, steal underpants. Step 2, and then there's just a big question mark, and then it's step 3, profit, right? And so, we've all heard business plans like this where it's like we do something happens, then money. And, that's very much the Western view of intellectual history. The Greeks were doing all these things. Aristotle was, classifying different forms of life and, seashells. And then, you have Socrates and Plato. And, there's all this sort of stuff that's happening that we sort of think of as proto-science. Then there is this big missing part where there's the Dark Ages. And then, the Renaissance, they go back, they study the Greeks, and then they pick up where they left off, and ta-da, science appears. And now we figured out how to figure out truth, how to figure out reality, and all of that. And that narrative is, more or less works if you're talking to a bunch of Westerners, because that's the narrative that we've been schooled on. But it's really problematic when you're talking to a Muslim, because they are that question mark. They are that middle stage. And not only did the Muslims take all of the knowledge of the Greeks and preserve it, but they built on it, and they advanced crucial things. And if you're going to, credit the scientific method to someone, the credit should probably go to Ibn Haytham, who was a Muslim, and that's not a very convenient narrative, especially when we think about this sort of strong science-religion divide, because, very devout Muslim people were the ones who really pioneered and developed the scientific method. What we talked about in that conversation is, and what he really appreciated is that the scientific method is merely a formalization of what people already do. So to be more intentional. So rather than your mom sort of like anecdotally figuring out, oh, this works or that works or whatever, we are just a little bit more thoughtful about it, where we say, okay, I think that this cream works on, curing these things. So let's really test that idea. Well, maybe this is, we maybe have like 100 people in the community. We're all going to test out this thing. We're going to try using it. We're going to try not using it. We're going to try and, really make sure that the only thing that we're changing is this one variable of this cream. And then that way we'll have some real sense of, does this cream actually work? Because of course we can all have good ideas and convince ourselves that our patent medicine works really, really well, because really we want our patent medicine to work well because then we can sell it and make money. But let's make sure that it is actually really helping people. So science is just doing what humans already do better in kitchens all over the world since the dawn of time, and just trying to do it a little bit better. At least that's what science is supposed to be. But again, there is this science as tribe, and just as you within your own Christian community, you have the sort of because Jesus crowd, we also have the because science crowd, for whom it's just a simple sort of shibboleth of you're in our tribe, you're not in our tribe. And these people do not help us to work out these Hatfield and McCoy issues.
So obviously a pragmatic example of that would be, or a real life example of something like aloe from a plant. So somebody somewhere got burned and figured, hey man, there's got to be something we can put on this, and somewhat of a trial by error. Somebody busted open one of those leaves, kind of rubs that ointment on there, and realizes it heals a little faster than it did last time, or that it did on its own. Continue to try to do that, and over a period of time, they realize, hey, if every time somebody gets a burn, just use rub the plant on them, and there you go. So would that be a kind of a fair, practical, real life example of something like that in terms of science, without having to go into like the chemical composition or what makes it actually work, but just more of that, this is a solution to that problem?
Yeah, and what you're talking about there is cultural evolution. I mean, that's the irony, is that, everybody, like, this is part of the other thing that you realize is silly, is that accumulated wisdom over time, that's evolution, right? And just as you can accumulate genetic changes that help you survive in an environment, you can accumulate cultural practices like rubbing aloe on a burn over time. And obviously the ones that, if there's like a whole bunch of different people in your community and some are rubbing aloe on burns and some people are rubbing poison ivy on burns, then the one who that sort of behavior of rubbing poison ivy on burns is going to die out. And the one where you rub aloe on burns is going to win. So the idea of evolution at its core is actually a concept that if you really poke around, like, we get hung up on the labels and the terms and the implications, but most people actually believe in evolution. And a lot of Christians in America believe strongly in the free market. Well, the free market is an evolutionary process. Where we get stuck is that people believe in evolution in certain areas of life, and then when we start to, like, if you're talking to Christians about evolution in terms of the free market, and then we say, and it also applies at the genetic realm, well, then now you lost me. Now it's uncomfortable. And in the same way, you'll have plenty of liberals who believe strongly in genetic evolution, right? But have an agenda to try and, have lots and lots of government regulation. And we start talking about how the free market can solve these problems maybe better. And suddenly you've lost them, right? Because the problem is that it's not really even that people don't believe in evolution. It's that they only believe in evolution in certain areas, and then they get really uncomfortable with the idea of letting go and losing control and extending it to all areas.
And so the word that keeps screaming in my head when you say that is fear, right? I think that there's definitely that fear that as you start to, that the idea is along these lines, if I do believe in evolution, then all of a sudden that means that I have to then conclude at some point that everything I believe in from a faith standpoint is wrong. To that, because I think there's, to me, that's at least as I see a lot of it. To that question, if I asked you as a Christian, can science and religion coexist?
I think absolutely, and I think that Sir Isaac Newton certainly had no problem with that idea. Newton believed that God had written two great books, the Bible and the universe, and that to be a real Christian, you had to study deeply in both. I think that's very much how the Muslims thought of it, and I think that they're absolutely compatible. And I think that, something that might be helpful. So I had a conversation with Adam Hansen, who I think you're probably going to have on the podcast.
Yes.
And, we were talking about the cross, and that there are these two dimensions of the cross, right? There's the up and down, and there's the left and right, right? And it's sort of like cross is grounded in the earth, but then it points at the heavens. And then it also is about sort of embracing the whole world. And the Bible is really sort of, a lot of it is dealing, there's a lot of practical advice in there, but, a lot of it is sort of about that upward dimension. And then, science is really just focused on the down to earth, the practical, at least that's what it's supposed to be about, of like, how can we understand reality better? How can we make sense of it? And I think this is, I think the more we understand that science and Christianity or faith, they're really just, they're warning against arrogance. They're warning against complacency, and they're trying to encourage us to spend more of our day in states of humility and curiosity. When you understand that they're advocating for the same neurological states and the same mental states, then you realize this is when the silliness of the Hatfield and McCoy argument becomes obvious.
And I think about one of the guests you've had on, and I listen to him mainly because I think it's important. I listen. So on Twitter, I'll follow atheists. I'll follow people who claim to be atheists because I think it's important to hear what they have to say. And I think it's important to listen to their argument. And I will say as a Christian, I don't fear science. I understand the worry about it becoming something that ultimately pushes you, or that the context, and a lot of times coming from the scientific side, is that ultimately you have to feel this way because of science, or that the logical conclusion in lieu of that is to then, okay, well, now you have to put the Bible away and stop believing in this nonsense. And there was even a comment on the Mixed Mental Hours Facebook page, which I'm on. After the first podcast, there was one of the gentlemen in the group who made the statement saying that, he was really, he said he even used the word concerned, and I don't think he meant it in a negative way, but that I used to be a free thinker and now I'm kind of not. And he kind of was really curious about that, as if there's that progression around that. And so when I hear people, I know the guest I was talking about was Lawrence Krauss, who is as you know better than I, because you've talked to him more than once, who is basically a militant atheist to the point where he has lobbied for and has argued that even teaching Sunday school and teaching children the Bible is a form of child abuse and should be prosecuted as such. And now, to be fair, before everybody gets all excited and starts, pitchforking and tweeting that this guy's a terrible human being, is it fair to say that the fear that somebody has of having their religion taken away is the same thing that's motivating him, because the fear is that religion is minimizing or is a governor on scientific exploration and continuing those almost limiting his belief? Would you say that's a fair assessment?
I think there's fear on both sides. I don't know what his particular fears and his particular anxieties are, but I think here's what might be really helpful. I've sort of over the last few years discovered the work of David Sloan Wilson and a whole bunch of other people. And, for a scientist, like a real scientist, if you're actually going to practice science, then you really have to, and you're curious about reality, then you have to be really curious about this phenomenon that we're calling religion. Because it's something that has existed in every culture to this day. Whatever it is, 90% of the world, some huge percentage of the world believes in these things. And you can't, the casual dismissal that people like Lawrence Krauss or Richard Dawkins practice, where they just sort of toss it aside and say it's wicked superstition or, anything like that. I mean, even, listen to their rhetoric. The rhetoric is that same rhetoric that has been used by religion against religion forever, right? That the land is filled with plague and pestilence, and then along came science, and there was the Enlightenment. And we talk about the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages. And even if you talk to historians about the so-called Dark Ages, they're like, well, I don't know. There's a lot of progress happening there and a lot of things that sort of set up the later stages. So what you're hearing here are these cultural prejudices, and that's not what science is. Like, real science is about curiosity. You have to be really curious about what is this giant phenomenon that we call religion. And, I think it might be helpful, you've been so candid and open, and I think it would be helpful to talk about my own road to Damascus experience of having the scales fall from my eyes.
Before we get to that, I wanted to ask you, there was an episode that I remember in terms of the Middle Ages and churches, that during that time period, if I remember correctly, that the church actually was the cultivator of science and the protector, and actually housed a lot of the things that were used after that particular period of time, and actually helped protect and cultivate what was science up until that time. Is that right? Or what was that context?
It goes even beyond that. Until Charles Darwin, most of science, or what they would have called natural philosophy, was being done by priests. It was being done by vicars, because they had some land, they had some prosperity, they were intellectually curious, and they had the time to do this work. And it's only when you get to the period around Darwin, and this is part of the politics and part of how it starts to shift, is that they wanted to have a professional cast of people that we would call scientists. And that's when the power and the financial resources start to move out of the hands of the church, and it starts to move into the hands of this professional cast. And again, Sir Isaac Newton. Newton had three great passions. And, they were natural philosophy, figuring out things like light and gravity, calculating the age of the earth based on the Bible, and religion in general. And then the third one was alchemy. And it's always interesting to me, the storytelling that if you go to a place like Oaks Christian, I'll talk to you about how, he was a natural philosopher and he was a Christian, because that's, would calculate the age of the earth based on the Bible, because that's useful for their narrative. They don't like the fact that he was an alchemist. And if you go and you talk to scientists, they like the fact that he was a natural philosopher because they think of that as science, and they don't like the fact that he calculated the age of the earth based on the Bible, or that he was an alchemist, because that's not good for them. Yeah. So, history is inconvenient, people are inconvenient, and these things are twisted in order to justify present political objectives. But the reality is that Newton's alchemy was vital to his most famous work with gravitation, because he had the conceptual leap to understand that bodies could be interacting without physically touching each other. And that is real magical thinking. And that's the sort of thing that would make sense to an alchemist, but wouldn't make sense to someone who didn't think that way.
There's such an irony to that in terms of how you're to today, where we see people, they'll quote a meme, or they'll put like an Albert Einstein or a Mark Twain or somebody up there. It makes me think, as well as somebody like myself, I think Chester Nimitz and Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower was born, I think, in Texas, and then, I think he grew up in Kansas. And so we always claim him, from a Texas standpoint. We're like, oh, but he was born here, so he's a Texan. And so there's some of that relationship where we can kind of say, oh yeah, he's that he's one of us, and look at how well he's doing because he was born in Texas. And then you see that now with Mark Twain and Albert Einstein, or they'll have some sort of quote, and they're like, well, Albert Einstein was really a Christian, and so that's why he should be listened to, or maybe he said this thing about Christ, or he said this something along the lines of looking at science and then trying to find this division. And so my hope from this conversation as well as you're looking at this is so people don't fear on each side, I think. And so I think to that point, because at the same time, what I do think what then causes the division is this idea that it becomes this right or wrong thing, or that you can't have these camps kind of exist in the same context, maybe the same Thanksgiving table, or that as people do learn, a lot of times there is this, I don't want to say natural progression, but there seems to be kind of this start out, you go to, you're taught as a child, you go to church, and then you go out into the real world and you learn things, and then all of a sudden there's this natural kind of sway, and you kind of leave the faith or leave this and pursue more of the logic and stuff like that. And so would you say in your experience around science that does tend to lend itself to get away from that? And then in the regard of just the meaning of life outside of just all this knowledge, kind of how do you balance that in terms of all this knowledge is great, like you said, at the same time it kind of comes up on some context a little bit short, but does the meaning of life outside of something like that mean anything to you, or are you just more worried kind of the day-to-day?
Yeah, I think my student at Oaks is super useful here because we're working through the controversy together, and then out of the mouths of babes, he said a question that I think is most important around this whole evolution debate, which is, he said, "Who cares where fish come from?" I mean, that's so much of what the argument is that, we're arguing about this seemingly very arcane point about the origins of fish and the origins of life. Now, I think evolution as a paradigm is super important, and I think those questions are super interesting, and I think that actually, if you're understanding the forces of life and how life evolved and came to be, that can illuminate our modern life. But in the end, the more that we can focus on fixing our own problems, in the day-to-day life, that it's then that you start to really get a sense of that sort of richer spiritual purpose. And I think that, Jesus was right when he said that man cannot live by bread alone. And I think that a lot of what we're seeing in the world is just that there are a lot of people who, there was this period of human history when we're really focused on the material above all else, and we now have largely, we haven't entirely fixed these problems, but for many, many people, those material needs have been met, and yet we're still so hungry. And that is a spiritual hunger. And in the end, I see myself as part of a very large evolutionary process that was around for billions of years before I showed up. I think of human history as a relay race. My job while I'm here is to make sure that I leave the world better than I found it. And I mean, I certainly feel I've had to find my way to purpose. And, one of the big books for me in doing that was Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. I think even having conversations with David Sloan Wilson, he talks, we had a conversation with him and Adam, and we were talking just about how most people are very uncomfortable with the idea of science as a religion. But it is a religion. What we're getting hung up on is that this taxonomy where we've defined science as being somehow special and different from other belief systems. Science has certain other, it's focused on the question of reality, but that doesn't mean that, the people feel a sense of purpose, and they need to feel like they're part of something larger, and that, we're doing worthwhile and meaningful work. A lot of us have become divorced from that, but I will tell you that within sort of the halls of science, of the lab coats, of the test tubes, that, to use C.S. Lewis's expression, that great divorce is felt. And I think that the more that we focus on just having conversations like this and bridging those gaps anywhere we can, that all sorts of things will emerge in the coming years. And that I think that we'll all realize that we've been very foolish, much as, the grand old man of the Hatfield clan realized, and that we've all been very blind for a very long time.
So to that, you alluded to it earlier, and and if you could extrapolate on that a little bit, you had mentioned fixing our own problems, and part of this, instead of trying to fix all of everybody's problems at one time, that the first step you really kind of have to take is the own scale and your own experience with the elephant, and you know what I'm alluding to, and how that, and kind of take us on a little bit of your personal journey on how you went from being that litigious scientist to somebody who is much more EQ based and using IQ as a resource, but being more EQ and more introspective, and kind of take us down that journey just a little bit, and how that and what that was like for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is, again, like this word reason, right? The version of reason that I internalized as a kid was essentially having reason, which is actually really rationalizing. Reason was about being able to rationalize whatever you believe. And then, I moved out to LA. Katie and I were working on this book, and Katie and I were focused on what we thought were two totally different problems. I was focused on very litigious, literal thing of what kids were saying about math genes, and these beliefs were wrong. They needed to be corrected in their beliefs. This is not what the science said, and that was the spirit in which I was approaching it. And Katie, coming from the humanities, was focused on this entirely different problem. She was like, look at these kids' faces. They're miserable. They're unhappy. They're stressed. They're not enjoying learning. This is not how life should be. Katie was endlessly patient with me, and I was in LA, and LA, because it's full of actors, it's a culture that endlessly talks about emotions. Like, my grandfather, who's from St. Joseph, Missouri, and by the way, Kansas claims Dwight Eisenhower as one of our own. There's that. But he always described California as the land of fruit and nuts.
Oh, yeah. And,
there's a lot to that. At a certain point, I got so annoyed by all these actors talking about emotions all the time. I was like, I will go off to the books of my people, and I will understand what these emotions things are, and then I will correct the faults in your thinking. So I wanted to
fix
litigiously, I'm going to fix you people because you don't know what you're talking about. And then I went away and read everything that I could on emotions. And, I read things like Descartes' Error by Antonio and Hannah Damasio, which is all about the fact that thinking and feeling are always linked, and that they're inseparable, and that Descartes made this mistake in thinking that they were separate. So I read Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, which made me realize that there's this fast, reactive, emotional thinking, and then there's this slow, reflective thinking. And then I read the work of John Haidt, and one of the things that he talks about in there is this rider and the elephant. The elephant is our reactive brain. It's our, for want of a better word, emotional brain. It gets triggered and it charges and it gets upset by things, very powerful and lumbering. And then there's our reflective brain, which is this small reflective rider that has the ability to slow the elephant down, really make us take our time and sort of nudge the elephant onto a better course. I realized I didn't know what the hell I was talking about. And it was so massively uncomfortable to realize that this whole time I'd been going around litigiously trying to correct the thoughts of these other people, and that actually they understood way more than I did. And I felt like a fool, and I was humiliated. In particular, it was really, John Haidt's The Happiness Hypothesis, finding modern truth and ancient wisdom, that really laid me low. And I remember reading that in the desert of Libya in 2007. So much of John's book is just about saying, Jesus taught this about the log in the eye, and how we see the splinter in our brother's eye so clearly, but we don't see the log in our own. Science has confirmed what Jesus said 2,000 years ago. And then, there's all this stuff from the Buddha. And, science, the Buddha talks about, Maya or illusion. And in science, we call it naive realism. It's the same thing. And again, he just goes through all the wisdom of the past and just is basically saying, yep, science has confirmed what we knew 2,000 years ago. That was a really uncomfortable truth for me, because I thought that everything before had been wicked superstition and idiocy, and that now we knew the truth. And it turned out that the real idiot was me.
What I'd like to build upon that sentiment of what he's talking about a little bit for those that are listening is is it it's okay to fear something. It's okay to have emotions around something. It's okay to feel a little bit of caution or wonder or worry, that all of these things that we feel are okay. And especially on something like what we're trying to do with this podcast and what we're trying to ultimately do for people that can take this conversation. And if you want to have another one with somebody that you may either worry or fear or have some sort of emotional reaction around that idea of conversating with them, that unto its own self, that's okay. If we can have a little bit of, so understand that fear, understand that emotion. To your point, be the rider on the big elephant and try to come and be a little bit more compassionate. And again, another feeling, right? That allows us to then just have a conversation around something, and don't try to get so far out of line, and don't fear science. And at the same time, I would argue, don't fear, and I hate calling it religion so much because there's always that negative connotation, but just what other people look at in terms of their faith, and how and why it is that they have it, and why it is that it's important to them, and that these are ideas that have much more in common and have much more and are going to coexist. And you kind of alluded to it earlier, Hunter, which is if we think that religion is going to go anywhere versus if you think science is going to go anywhere, if you think that it's just, it's kind of like the fish, it's going to eat Darwin and it's just going to go away, and you're right, and it just science, it has to be this right or wrong. This hey, y'all, this life's a team sport, and we're in this thing together, and arguing about it and using that winner take all kind of mindset just isn't going to do it. And to your point, that there is that breakthrough moment. I had it in a little bit different way, and I won't go into it, but it was really that realization of just how, to be fair, how dumb or how inadequate or how much is out there that you don't know, that you truly, and that's really, and that's why I appreciate who you are, and that's why I love having you on this podcast and love having you and would love to continue to have you on there, is that realization of that, the reality and what you don't know, that's really the overwhelming factor for you, is just this paradox of, yeah, man, I got a small taste of what I think I know, but based on what's out there, man, I really don't have a clue. But, instead of just kind of going into the corner and putting your thumb in your mouth, hey, let's go out and kind of apply this method and learn and break things and make that kintsugi, as you like to refer to it, which is this idea of taking broken pieces and putting them back together again and making something anew and breaking them again and bringing them back together to the fold. And if we can take something away from this, which is that opportunity to break that and build back upon that again, then I just want to encourage people out there to have that conversation and not to fear science, not to fear knowledge, not to fear these things, that they don't mean you have to just give up on everything you've ever believed in or that you've ever thought. I don't know. That's kind of one of my 2 cents worth of conclusion relative to what you're saying. And I don't think we should fear science from a faith standpoint. I think I would argue on some level that I think science reveals God, as I see it, and reveals some that beauty, reveals reveals all these things we don't know. And there's so much wonder, and there's so much beauty, true beauty out there, and how complex the human body is, and how amazing the nervous system is, and how amazing the way that the body just is just how life creates in the very beginning. And in terms of like when it starts and all the rest of that stuff, we can get into that one, I think, for another episode. But just the fact that it even exists in its own right.
And to build off of that, Sean, I think it's really important for your listeners to know that anybody who is arrogant is telling you that they're not a scientist. There are 60 million scientific papers, 130 million books. It is literally impossible for any human being to know it all. And the point of, I had a great conversation with Michael Garfield, he's actually in Austin, but he's a paleontologist who uses paleontology to make sense of the future and sort of look at these evolutionary patterns, try and understand where we are, where we might be going. And he made connected these great dots that I really appreciated, which is that the curiosity is actually the opposite of fear. So much of that fear is, absolutely what's driving things on both sides of the aisle here. And really, science requires curiosity of us. It requires humility of us. And anybody who is, like, even though Lawrence Krauss is a, PhD and he has a professor and he can quote all of that dogma, he actually doesn't understand the core of what science is. And this is a problem that is familiar to any Christian. Like, false prophets have always been an issue. And false prophets can always quote more dogma. They know the text better than anyone, but they don't get the spiritual core of what the discipline, the religion, the epistemological method, whatever you want to call it, is really, really about.
Oh, exactly. I know people that I've come across people that can, like you said, can quote, chapter and verse. They can give you every scripture out there. No idea what it means. No idea what it means. None.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that I do. I kind of look at it like a scientific thing. My journey is to try to understand that more and more, because you can go back and revisit some of these things, and it just, the lessons and the narratives and the stories continue to take on different meanings and new perspective. It is that discovery. It is that self-discovery. It is that, and how it applies pragmatically, and not even from a pragmatic standpoint, but from a how does this solve a problem, or how do I look at this in terms of life? Can this help me with my marriage? Can it help me with my relationships? Can it help me with my kids? Can it help me with my fellow man? How does it help me deal with suffering? How does it help me deal with these things, and really take the marrow of what's being said, instead of just using it as some arrow to shoot across the room that just isn't doing anybody any good by doing that, because you have no idea what it means. You're just throwing it out there, hoping that it sticks, or using it as some sort of point, counterpoint kind of thing, as if that's the thing. So again, I hope that hope it shed a little bit of light. We're up against an hour 15. So look, man, this, and I want to have you back on. I could sit here for another 10 or 15 hours, I'm sure, and do this again. I really could. And so I'd love to have you back on. I definitely appreciate this opportunity to talk about this. I think if anything, it was a beginning of again, more of these opportunities to discuss and create and lessen that fear and bridge that gap, and just ask you to the table. One day, I obviously hope to have you actually physically here, joining us from LA. I appreciate your time. I know you're a busy man, as we discussed, and just very, very grateful for that as well. And so one of the things I like to do, that if you're okay, is I like to end my podcast, and I like to pray over it. And so if you wouldn't mind joining me with that, I'd appreciate that.
It would be my pleasure.
Awesome. Please pray with me. Heavenly Father, I just hope that what people hear more than anything else in the context of what we just talked about is just an appreciation, is a mutual respect, admiration, and a love for a fellow man on both sides of the aisle. I think it's so humbling to me to hear somebody else talk about that what they really want to do with their world, what they really want to do with their life is make the world a better place and serve others, which, as I know it and as I see it, and what you're asking us to do, and what the words in red are convicting us as Christians to do, is exactly that: is to serve, and is to love, and is to be that presence to other people. And I love that. I think about St. Francis of Assisi. I think about the current Pope, of that idea of go forth and preach the gospel, and only when necessary use words, and that's ultimately that's how you see it, and that's what it is, and that it's that almost that scientific aspect of seeing that real life example, the data, the result of what that means out there in the world. And I thank you for Hunter's time. I thank you for this opportunity. I thank you for just the fact that we can even do this in this world is not something that's common, and that we're very blessed by being able to do that. I just please give Hunter safe travels as he goes forth to Italy and has his vacation and all of that. And I just ask that you continue to bless him and give him strength and courage and insight. And I'm just so grateful for our relationship. And it's in your son's name that we pray. Amen. All right, buddy. Well, I'm going to sign us off. Thank you so much again for out there, for the podcast. As always, would love to hear for you. It's the Come to the Table podcast at gmail.com. If you want to email us, you can reach us. You can find us on Facebook. Follow us there. Obviously, subscribe to the podcast. All that typical stuff that we want you to do. And the idea is each week we're going to have these kind of episodes out there to get you to come to the table and talk about a subject, bridge that gap between people on all these different aspects. And let us know what you think. And if you have any ideas, let us know. If you want to have somebody on, let us know. Definitely want to have Hunter back, and looking forward to it. If there's something you'd love to hear Hunter talk about, please let us know. And at the same time, I would encourage all of you to go. And there's a lot of episodes, but if you heard in Hunter a wisdom, I don't want to say you're smart, I'd say a wisdom. And if you liked what he said and it resonates with you, go subscribe to his podcast. Hey, there's plenty of room at the table. There's plenty of room. There's plenty of market out there. This is not typical, only this podcast and just this podcast. Go subscribe, and you get to hear people like Michael Callan, who's my favorite guest ever, who is his co-host Brian Callan's dad. And it makes me excited to think if you could give them both a hello from me and let them know that as one of the fans out there, that all the podcasts that you're doing, that there's people listening, and definitely appreciate the efforts that they're making and really love that. So if you like that kind of thing, I challenge you to go out there and listen to them and hear their podcast and hear these other people that he's talking about, like David Sloan Wilson and Jared Diamond and even Lawrence Krauss. Listen to what other people have to say, even if it's highly contradictory to what you think, and even if it's a little bit abrasive. Take comfort and let that fear go and hear what they have to say and just give them and appreciate and respect what they're saying. I think a lot more can be done in that, and there's no reason to be scared about it. Definitely not from a faith standpoint as I see it. All right, buddy, I'm going to sign us off. Any last parting words for the first episode you want to give to the listeners before we head out?
Yeah, the only thing I would say, Sean, is that you at some point wrote something, several months ago about how, you weren't likely to see Brian Callen and me take a pew anytime soon. But I will tell you that if you were the face of Christianity, and if more Christians really not just, paid lip service to the ideas that Jesus is talking about, but like really lived them in the way that I see you living them, that we would be much more likely to take a pew. I think that I'm very grateful for you, and I'm very grateful to have had this opportunity.
Well, that's very a little bit overwhelming to hear you say that, but and I'll say this: there's a lot of people that I know that I've come across in my life who I think you get that same reaction from, and I think if we can just, I truly believe this, if we can just pull back a little bit of that anger and that fear and that emotion, as odd as this may sound, to be a little bit more rational, I think you'd come to find out that there's a lot more of those people that are out there. If they could just get over their worry about, all those things we see. I think a lot of those people that are saying stuff that if you really, to be fair, Hunter, if you really were to go to that person who writes that BS comment on Facebook that sounds racist or whatever else, and you really went down to it and got down to the nitty gritty, I think you'd find out that they're just scared, or they're not really sure what to say, or the rest of that stuff. But I definitely appreciate you saying that. That is how I see it as far as the gospel. I think, and I say it on the other side as well, from a scientific approach, from that all-knowing, all that, kind of this, I know everything and you don't. If more people in the scientific community, and even on the atheist side, or even on those, whatever, all that stuff, if they were a lot like you, and they were more like you, and I hear Brian talk about it, and we can plug it for the sake of it. It's very humbling to me to hear Brian's one of the first people, and you know this when listening to your episodes, when somebody like Jared Diamond or anybody else brings up religion and they kind of give their opinion on it, he's one of the first people to try to defend it, even though he's not a Christian and he's not even a religious person. And he'll say that, and he'll start to make that argument. Well, don't you think, or don't you understand? And so that's one of the reasons I think these conversations are easy, and why I think that it's a little bit more like that than it's not. He doesn't want people to ignore science. You don't want people to ignore science. But if you give people a little bit of a respect and an opportunity, and you're open with them, and you don't judge them, truly judge them. And again, this is all stuff, we're not really doing anything different, right? You mentioned that earlier. It's all that we're regurgitating the same stuff from before, and it's part of that ongoing mission to remind everybody of that. And so I appreciate that, but I would return that and likewise on your side of it as well. All right, brother. Well, I appreciate it. I'm going to sign off, and thank you so much, man. I'm just humbled, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, man. Thank y'all. We're out.
Thank you so much for listening to the Come to the Table podcast. As always, we hope our conversations inspire you to invite someone you know and love to the table to have an open, loving, and respectful discussion, maybe even a difficult one. If that happens, we'd be honored if you would contact us about it so we could share it. Thanks again.
And God bless everyone.